Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of EUROSAC and CEPI Eurokraft, I have the great pleasure to welcome you to the second and final session of this year's webinar series on unwrapping sustainability across the value chain with paper sacks. Great to have you all with us. My name is Ingo Theissen, and I'm looking forward to guiding you through the upcoming program. So our topic of today is Beyond Packaging, Exploring the LCA of paper sacks. What do we mean by beyond packaging? Well, it goes without saying that assessing and reducing CO2 emissions throughout the product life cycle of packaging is crucial for environmental preservation, meeting consumer expectations, long-term sustainability, and also regulatory compliance. So today we will, of course, be looking at industry improvements in the life cycle assessment and carbon footprint of kraft paper and paper sacks. But there is more to the topic than that in terms of requirements and also in terms of potential benefits. That's why we want to take a closer look at it, going beyond just the packaging. Therefore, we will also address the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and the impact of the upcoming obligation to report on Scope 3 emissions. Furthermore, environmental responsibility can also go hand in hand with growth opportunities and competitive advantages. For example, by having a positive impact on corporate value and economic performance. So properly balancing these critical issues can help your organization offer or select packaging solutions that are in line with environmental goals, regulatory framework, and your business objectives. So a classic win-win-win situation. So now let's take a quick look at today's program and speakers. We have in our time, and we will see 3 short presentations. As you can see, we actually had 3 speakers scheduled for today. Unfortunately, Alexander Rosner had to cancel at short notice due to illness. So Alexander, we wish you a speedy recovery. Fortunately, however, we do not have to do without the topic of the lecture. Judith Rupert-Zoltowski, who has worked with Alexander in the past, is herself quite an expert in the field, and she has kindly agreed to take over his part as well. We therefore have the pleasure of listening to Judith twice today. So first on the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and Scope 3 emissions, and then followed by relevance and impact of life cycle assessments on corporate value and economic performance. Starting off, however, will be Michael Sturgis with his presentation on the results of our latest LCA carbon footprint study for sack kraft paper and paper sacks. Please note that the full webinar will be recorded and made available for streaming on eurosac.org afterwards. What else is there to know? Each presentation will be followed by a question and answer session in which you can all participate. To do so, please submit your questions anytime during the speeches by using the Q&A button, which you find on the bottom of the Zoom application. There you can also see the questions of other participants. The questions will be answered at the end of each presentation, and please note that the chat function remains deactivated the entire time. So to increase interactivity, I strongly encourage you to actively use the Q&A function. If there is not enough time to answer your questions, you can send an email to info@eurosac.org, and we will try to answer it in the follow-up. We will also have a survey before each presentation that will automatically pop up on your screen. You can participate by simply clicking on your preferred answer. I suggest we do our first survey right now to check if it works for everyone. So here comes the question: for how long do EUROSAC and CEPI Eurokraft conduct LCAs? Is it A, for 5 years, B, for 10 years, or C, for more than 15 years? So I will give you a couple of seconds to make your choice. We can close the survey then. So let's take a look at the result. So, well, the majority thinks that it's for more than 15 years. Some people also think that it's for 10 years or 5 years. Well, I'm sure that our first speaker will provide us with clarity on this question. And here is already Michael Sturgis, research consultant at RISE Research Institute of Sweden. Michael is a regular speaker at our webinars. For those who don't know him yet, he has more than 25 years of experience working with environment and sustainability issues applicable to fiber-based and bio-based materials and products. He has a strong focus on data-driven analysis for informed decision-making and is skilled in the application of techniques such as life cycle assessment, carbon footprint, and GHG assessments. Today, Michael will present to us the outcome of the newest LCA carbon footprint study for sack kraft paper and paper sacks. So, welcome, Michael. And before you start, can you tell us the correct answer to the survey question?
Hi, Ingo. Thank you for that. Yeah, so the first survey by RISE on behalf of CEPI Eurokraft and EUROSAC was in 2007. So the correct answer was C, more than 15 years. So we're going to have a look at some of those results now and how they've changed over the years.
All right, perfect. Well, then we are looking forward to your presentation. The floor is all yours.
Okay, brilliant. I'm going to present the latest results for the life cycle inventory and carbon footprint of sack kraft paper and paper sacks. First of all, just to provide some definitions, what we mean by some of these terms. So life cycle assessment is a tool or technique that quantifies the environmental impacts of a product or system within a defined set of boundaries. And those boundaries can be cradle to gate or cradle to grave. And typically cradle to grave would include the winning and conversion of raw materials, the conversion of those raw materials into final products, the distribution, use, and final waste management of those products. Life cycle inventory is a key part of life cycle assessment. A life cycle inventory is a quantified list of all the inputs and outputs for each of the unit processes that make up the product system. And life cycle impact assessment converts that inventory into a meaningful set of impact categories. So it takes the long list of life cycle inventory data and maps it to the impacts that are caused by those resource uses or emissions or effluents. So we have things such as climate change or carbon footprint, acidification, eutrophication, ecotoxicity, etc. Meaningful environmental impact categories. The work that CEPI Eurokraft and EUROSAC undertakes is a triennial analysis of the life cycle inventory and the carbon footprint for the gate-to-gate boundaries of paper sacks and sack kraft paper. Okay, so we look at the life cycle inventory data for the processes of producing sack kraft paper and manufacturing paper sacks from that sack kraft paper, and then we apply life cycle impact assessment, a full cradle to gate and cradle to grave analysis, but only of the carbon footprint. We don't do all of the impact categories, just the climate change impact. What's the motivation for this? What are the benefits to the industry? Well, it allows us to track and therefore communicate trends in the environmental performance of the sector. It also ensures that stakeholders are using up-to-date data when they make their own LCA studies. And this is proved particularly important where we've seen comparative LCAs comparing paper sacks and alternatives such as plastic form-fill seal sacks. A lot of the studies had previously been based on outdated data. We make sure that the most recent data is available so that those studies can be performed on a fair and even basis. It also provides insights on the road to carbon neutrality. So where in the value chain are our biggest opportunities to reduce carbon impact? And that's important when we consider the EU commitment to reduce emissions by 50% by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2050. We're going to have to contribute to that reduction if those targets are going to be achieved. So, if we think about the gate-to-gate life cycle inventory first, then the boundaries for the production of sack kraft paper, what we do is we produce an inventory that shows all of the inputs and all of the outputs to the mill. So from the mill in gate to the mill out gate. Right? So all of the blue items are included in the boundaries: the pulp preparation, stock preparation, refining, any on-site power and heat production, any on-site wastewater treatment, and finally the paper machine, including winding and rewinding. By quantifying those inputs and outputs, we can combine that with other secondary data sets on the inputs and outputs to the technosphere to have the full cradle to gate and or cradle to grave impacts. Some of the highlights of the findings from the gate-to-gate LCI. First of all, overall fossil fuel consumption within the mills has been reduced by 9% between 2015 and 2021. Interestingly, internally produced biofuels account for 78% of the energy consumption at the mills. And in total, internal plus externally purchased biofuels account for 92% of the energy consumed at the site, of the fuels consumed on site. The mills produced 59% of their own electricity requirements. And of the purchased grid electricity, nearly 30% of that has been identified as green electricity. And by green, we mean low carbon. So from renewable sources such as wind, solar, hydro, or from nuclear. Now you can see here, we have trends from 2007 through to 2021. The method has developed over time. We include more things in the analysis now. So you can see we include the internal biofuels consumption in the quantification that wasn't included in the first iteration. Also, there was a change of methodology between 2012 and 2015 to reflect changes in international practices in LCA. But nonetheless, this still gives us some really good trend information that we can track over time. Now, those changes in energy consumption at the mill mean that there have also been improvements in GHG emissions. So again, if we start from 2015, when the new methodology was implemented, then CO2 emissions between 2015 and 2021, fossil CO2 emissions have been reduced 9%. Between 2007 and 2021, there's been a 24% reduction. Okay. So we start to see where we have made improvements in terms of energy efficiency, in terms of GHG emissions on site. We apply the same logic to the sack converting facilities. We have gate-to-gate boundaries. We look at the point from which the paper enters the plant to the point at which paper sacks leave the plant ready for delivery to the filler. So we include any printing, tube forming, folding and gluing, and on-site heat and energy production that may occur at the converting plants. And again, some selected highlights. We've focused on the energy highlights here, but we have data for emissions to air, emissions to water, etc. What we see is that the total energy consumption per tonne of production has fluctuated slightly, but has stayed broadly the same between 2009 and 2021. And 9% of the purchased grid electricity consumed by converters in 2021 was identified as green electricity. You will see an increase in consumption 2009 to 2012. We believe that that was really due to the effects of the financial crisis, where demand for paper sacks fell quite sharply. You have a fixed energy requirement, which means that the impact per ton of production was increased. Okay? But since then, we've seen a steady-ish decline, but not enough to make major claims about. If we combine that life cycle inventory data with upstream data sets, then we can get a cradle-to-gate fossil carbon footprint. And here we see the cradle-to-gate fossil carbon footprint for sack kraft paper. We can see a consistent downward trend in the fossil carbon impact, 5% reduction between 2018 and 2021, and a 26% reduction between 2007 and 2021. We do see the shares of the different parts of the supply chain changing slightly, but broadly we see that the direct emissions from incineration of fuels on site are a large share, followed by the purchased grid electricity, non-fibre inputs, etc. If we then look at the cradle-to-gate fossil carbon footprint for paper sacks, then what we see is the production of the paper dominates the footprint, not surprisingly. Okay. There hasn't been a significant change per ton of paper sacks between 2018 and 2021. However, between 2007 and 2021, there's been a 16% reduction in impact per ton. If we equate that to the reduction in impact per sack, it becomes more impressive because of lightweighting efforts in paper sacks during that time. So it equates to a 28% reduction in impact per paper sack between 2007 and 2021. Now, that was a cradle-to-gate analysis focused on fossil emissions. CEPI have produced a methodology which extends the boundaries to include cradle-to-grave and to include biogenic emissions, biogenic removals, and emissions due to land use change. However, there are some challenges in applying the extended methodology. There are difficulties in quantifying biogenic emissions and removals accurately, and therefore having a sensible balance of the biogenic carbon cycle. And there is a lack of data on the recycling rate, the genuine recycling rate for used paper sacks. Nonetheless, if we apply the extended methodology, we do get some additional insights. What we find is that paper sacks have the potential to be a carbon negative packaging solution. And that paper sacks themselves, they contain and store carbon, and therefore the recycling of paper and board products, such as paper sacks, delays that CO2 from returning to the atmosphere. So the recycling of paper sacks at end of life should be encouraged and pursued. That is my summary of the carbon impact and life cycle inventory for paper sacks and sack kraft paper.
Well, thank you, Michael, for this very informative presentation. I think these are quite some impressive results, actually, over the last 15 years. Just a quick reminder to the audience, please feel free to enter your questions for Michael in the Q&A section. While we are waiting for questions from the audience, Michael. May I fire up the first one? So what are actually the quick wins for further reducing the footprint?
Yeah, so that's a good question. If you remember, we said that 30% of the purchased grid electricity from the paper mills was identified as green electricity. And I forget the exact number, but something like 9% of the purchased electricity for the converting plants is identified as green electricity. There's an opportunity for a very quick win to implement green electricity purchasing policies, to purchase specifically low carbon electricity. That would be my recommendation for a very quick win.
Okay, thank you, Michael. So we have a question from the audience. Miguel is asking, are there companies recycling paper sacks to make new paper sacks?
Yeah, that's a good question. There are 3 companies that we're aware of that are currently undertaking recycling to produce sack kraft fibre. They were subject of some of the discussion in the last webinar. So perhaps, Miguel, you might want to catch up on that once it's available. But yeah, there is increasing interest in recycling of paper sacks and producing paper sacks from recycled materials.
Good reminder, last week we talked about this, and the recording of last week's webinar is available on eurosac.org if you would like to check it up. We have another question that just came in. Paper represents the largest share of the footprint for paper sacks. Paper production is an energy-intensive process. So what can be done to achieve significant reductions in carbon emissions from paper production?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another good question. So I think the paper industry is very proactive in addressing carbon reduction and decarbonisation. There is it's obviously CEPI has its net zero roadmap, and there are initiatives by individual paper companies for replacing the need for fossil fuel and purchased electricity. I'm aware of projects looking at hydrogen as a fuel source, projects looking at biomass as a fuel source for heat and energy production, and also the electrification of steam production is something that's being seriously investigated by many paper companies. So it is challenging. There are significant barriers to decarbonisation of any energy-intensive industry, but we're seeing innovative technologies being developed and tested and hopefully implemented that will help us to achieve lower carbon impact of production of paper and production of any energy-intensive material.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Well, there are no other questions for the moment, but I would suggest while we continue with the next topic, of course, you are still welcome to post questions regarding Michael's presentation in the Q&A section. He will answer them in writing during the webinar. If there are any questions coming to your mind afterwards, you can always send us an email to info@eurosac.org, and we will be happy to answer it in the follow-up. So thank you all for your questions, and thanks, Michael, for your contribution. And we will see you back on screen before we close again. So thank you for the moment. And we continue actually with our second survey question. And the question is, has your company already measured its Scope 3 emissions? So please enter your answers now. I'm really looking forward to the result. So yeah, well, it's quite divided. We have not entirely half of the people, of the companies who have done it already, and 33% no, and 24% who are not sure. Well, thank you all for voting, and I am certain that our next speaker will be happy to share her insights on the topic with us. So a warm welcome to Judith Rupert-Soltowski. Judith is the director of the London-based consulting firm Chemi Limited and has worked as a sustainability consultant since 2011. Her areas of expertise include carbon accounting, carbon credit trading, and general sustainability management, with a particular focus on sustainable value chain management. Being a trained global reporting initiative and EcoVadis expert, Judith mainly helps clients navigate their sustainability reporting and rating requirements. And today she will introduce us to the significance and implications of the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. So Judith, welcome. And before you start, so what do you think about the results of our survey? Do they meet your expectations?
I'm actually positively surprised, I have to say. I would have expected more people to say no. We haven't yet, because I had prepared myself to say, oh, you better measure your Scope 3 emissions now because of what I'm about to present. But yeah, so that's encouraging to see that at least the majority or more people are aware of their Scope 3 emissions. Yes, so I will talk to you today about the CSRD, which is short for the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and what that means for your Scope 3 reporting, or generally your carbon reporting practices. So initially, I will introduce you to the concept of the greenhouse gas protocol, as that's our foundation for calculating a carbon footprint. Before we sort of dig a little bit deeper and look at the different type of scopes and why Scope 3 is particularly relevant for the incoming EU legislation. So Q&A at the end, and I look forward to lots of interesting questions. But for now, let's look at the greenhouse gas protocol. Basically, that's the underpinning framework for carbon accounting and carbon reporting. And it's been around for, I think, 22 years, a bit more than 20 years now, and was convened by the WRI and the WBCSD. And it covers 6 greenhouse gases, okay? Because we always talk about CO2, but it's actually more than CO2. It covers 6 gases that are all then converted to CO2e, so CO2 equivalents, to have a sort of standardized metric here. So basically, that's the tool that tells us how to get to our carbon footprint, or the reporting framework to do so. Also, what the greenhouse gas protocol tells us is that we need to calculate our Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Scope 1 emissions are emissions that directly occur within your organization through the combustion of fuel. Yeah. So that, for example, could occur by heating, using gas or oil to heat your offices or your factories, but also by burning fuel through your company fleet. Yeah. So these are our direct emissions, Scope 1. Then Scope 2, these are indirect emissions that stem from the purchase of electricity. Yeah. And our Scope 3 emissions are basically all other indirect emissions that occur in our value chain. So emphasis here on value chain, because it's split into upstream activities and also in downstream activities. So these are the trickier bits. Yeah. So for example, that includes employee commuting, business travel, the waste generated in operations, transport and distribution, but also the use of your sold products, what emissions stem from that, or the end of life treatment of your product. Yeah. Or for example, any investments you might have made or any leased assets you might have. So you can see that is suddenly a huge variety of factors to take into account, which is, I think, why companies are usually a little bit overwhelmed when they start carbon accounting, because Scope 3 seems sort of very, it seemed like a lot. Now, to look a bit closer at Scope 3 emissions, the greenhouse gas protocol only requires us to communicate scope 1 and 2. Yeah, scope 3 has always been optional, and I think that's why a lot of companies so far have chosen to only report on their scope 1 and 2 emissions. However, there's really no way around scope 3. Okay, firstly, because if you want to roll out a holistic climate protection strategy, you need to look at all of your emissions, not only scope 1 and 2. You need to look at your entire value chain if you want to make any meaningful reductions. And also, recent studies have shown that actually scope 3 emissions make up 65 to 95% of most companies' carbon impact. Okay, so it's really not to be neglected, because you would cut out the lion's share of your entire carbon impact. Now, to get to your scope 3 emissions, you really need to engage with your suppliers and vendors across your entire value chain, and that is the tricky bit. Data collection can often be very, very challenging, and we can talk about that maybe a little bit later during the Q&A, what the challenges are. So, however, as I said, there's no way around scope 3, not only for the reason of having to create a holistic carbon reduction strategy, but also because of incoming EU legislation. So as Ingo was saying earlier, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive will come into force on the 1st of January 2024, which is basically the EU's attempt to standardize sustainability reporting to ensure comparability and a higher level of sustainability reporting. Because so far we've had sort of a few internationally recognized standards, which are really good. However, there's been a lot of, let's say, wiggle room on what can be reported and how it can be reported. So this is the EU's attempt to kind of regulate that sustainability reporting space. And initially, it's a staged approach, but initially, large companies and listed companies are required to report or are subject to the CSRD. So what does large company mean? You are considered a large company if you fulfill at least two of the following. You either have over 250 employees, and or net revenue of 50 million euros and or 25 million euros in total assets. Okay, so if your company falls into any of those two categories, then you will be subject to the CSRD in the next few years. And that also means that you're required to report on scope 3 emissions. So those, Ingo, what was it, 29%? Or I forgot the figure that said that they don't know their scope 3 emissions yet.
Well, 24 that didn't know if they measure it already, and 33% who are not doing it right now. Okay, so those 57% better get the calculator out and start praying that they don't have more than 250 employees. So let's look at this new reporting standard a bit more closely. So the CSRD is the directive, and then this directive was translated into the European Sustainability Reporting Standard, or in short, ESRS. So that is the new reporting framework, and that sort of at the moment is it's like a set of sector agnostic standards, and in the future we will have more sector specific standards as well. So each industry will have more, let's say, personalized KPIs that they are required to report on. But for the sector agnostic standards, we have some sort of general disclosures that we will be required to make. And then we also have topic specific standards that will need to be addressed, which are divided into ESG, environment, social, governance. Okay. And now you can see under these topics here, we have different subtopics, and which means that these are potential topics that could be relevant for your organization, but you are required to conduct a so-called materiality analysis. So you need to sit down with your internal and external stakeholders, and you need to go through
a very specific process to decide which of these factors are relevant for your organization or material for your organization. Yeah. So technically, climate change, if you can read this, I hope you can read this well, ESIS E1, that is subject to a materiality analysis. So a company could decide that it's not material for their organization, which is why initially they wanted to make climate change compulsory. Yeah. Anyway, it is not compulsory now, but if you do leave out climate change, if you do argue that it's not relevant for your organization, you need to give very, very detailed reasons for why it's not, which will be essentially impossible. Yeah. However, to give companies a helping hand, they decided that companies with more than 750 employees can at least skip the reporting on the Scope 3 emissions for the first year, just to sort of get their act together. Yeah. And now to close the loop to my initial slide, whatever you're required to do under ESIS E1 climate change is tightly aligned with the standards set out in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and also with the methodology used by the Science Based Targets Initiative. Okay. So that's about the content of the ESIS and what are you required to report. Now let's look at the timeline. So as of next January, companies will have to report that we're already subject to the NFRD, so the Non-Financial Information Disclosure Directive. Then the year after, in 2025, all large companies are required to report. So large companies are defined as I set out on my previous slide. And as of 2026, all listed SMEs and small and non-complex credit institutions or insurance companies are also required to report. Yeah. This is the rule for EU companies. Now, I'm just looking at maybe some of the British attendees here. This also actually applies to companies that are not EU companies, but make more than 150 million euro in revenue in the EU and have at least one subsidiary or branch in the EU. Mm-hmm. What is very special or for a lot of people frightening about the CSRD reporting is that it will be part of your annual financial statement, and therefore it will be subject to an independent and external audit. So it is therefore it's paramount that you have an ironclad carbon footprint, including Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Okay, I think that is it for my first presentation. I'm happy to take any questions if there are any already.
Thank you, Judith. Well, I must say that I have a much better understanding now of the CSRD. So thank you for that already. And that's well, we are still waiting for questions to come in. So another reminder for the audience, please ask your questions for Judith by using the Q&A tool. Well, I will ask the first question then, Judith, while we are waiting for questions from the audience. So how do the CSRD and the EU taxonomy relate, actually?
Yeah, so that's a good question. They're both part of the EU Green Deal. Okay, so, and mainly the intention of the EU was to funnel more funds into more sustainable or greener companies' products initiatives. Okay, so the idea is to make better decisions, more informed decisions, in order to select more sustainable companies' products activities. Yeah, so they're both part of the EU Green Deal. Whoever is eligible for the CSRD, meaning whoever needs to report according to the CSRD requirements, is also eligible to the EU taxonomy. Yeah, so under the EU taxonomy, companies need to prove or need to show that their products or activities are taxonomy compliant, or essentially that they are green. Okay, to completely simplify this complex text, you need to prove that that your products are green, and it will be standardized, which is why they created a set of standards you need to fulfill in order to be able to claim that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, and what's interesting, and I think that's now coming back to Michael's work as well, is that what we're seeing in this space, in the taxonomy space, comes very close, or the requirements that we've sort of encountered, that comes very close to LCA requirements. Okay, so if you do LCAs, you will be well prepared for whatever you will face under the EU taxonomy.
All right, thank you. We got a question from the audience. Well, we've been talking about the Scope 3 emissions. The question is, what's so challenging about collecting Scope 3 emissions?
Yeah, that's a good one. It could be either or. So either there's a lack of data availability, and we try to work with suppliers, but they might not capture data, or they might not be willing to cooperate, or whatever the reason is. Or it might be the exact opposite. We might not be able to handle the volume of data coming in, thousands of data points, which all require a specific emission factor. Yeah? And that's probably my third point, the availability of valid emission factors. So there are obviously databases, but for certain emission factors, you need to really read scientific papers and work out how you could translate into an emission factor for the specific thing you're trying to calculate right now. Yeah. So there's a lot of, let's say, guesstimation happening as well, which is then obviously prone to inaccuracy.
Yeah, I see. Okay. Well, there are no more questions for the moment, but as you are still with us for a little longer, Judith, so again, a reminder to the audience, if you have any other questions coming to your mind about this topic, you can still post these in the Q&A section. And in the meantime, Judith, I suggest that we move forward to our next topic. But before we do so, we have another survey question. Do you think providing an LCA has a competitive advantage for your company? Yes, no, or not sure? Okay, I think we can come to an end now. We can close the question. So yeah, the majority, well, almost 90% think that definitely it has a competitive advantage. And well, two people, one thinks that not, and one is not sure. So, but this is a very clear image that we are getting there. So thank you all for voting. And Judith, now we are, of course, looking forward to hearing your perspective on the question.
I think Alex would be very happy, would be very pleased to see that answer, because that's what his presentation is based on. I think in the presentation, Alex gave us 9 really good reasons for why it is an advantage. So he's looking a little bit more deeply into why that is a benefit for a company, or for a company's corporate value or economic performance. Yeah. So, but I'm happy to see that other people think so as well. Okay, so I hope I'll do him justice. And I think what Alex's main point was that he wants to get across was that the impact LCAs can have on a company's value or economic performance are multifaceted. Yeah. So one that springs to mind very quickly is competitive advantage, and it's one of his points. But let's look a little bit at the other reasons. So some of them are more tangible than others. Yeah, we have some sort of soft impacts as well, such as consumer loyalty or reputational benefits. And some are a little bit more tangible, like access to green financing or investor attraction. Okay, so let's explore those in a bit more detail. The first one, I guess, is a bit more of a soft one. But if you do conduct an LCA, you can increase your company's reputation because you're showing that you're environmentally conscious, that you're committed to sustainability, And that can actually not only attract consumers, or especially of the younger generation, but also investors. And therefore, you can increase your company's brand value and therefore your market share. So that is a good one. The next one sort of ties in what I was saying before, that you're well positioned when upcoming regulation comes in, or for any sort of compliance reasons. So like I mentioned before, CSRD and EU taxonomy will have a major impact on the European economy and also beyond. So by conducting LCAs, you'll be well set up for whatever the EU taxonomy will throw at you. Yeah, that's the point. Sort of I was trying to get across earlier as well. Then not to forget operational efficiency. So this is one of the classic arguments, I think, when this whole sustainability thing took off a few years ago, is you can save money by being more sustainable. So I guess when you conduct an LCA, you identify high impact or high environmental impact areas, which can be improved. Yeah? And this will not only lead to emission reduction or reduction of resource consumption, it'll actually also lead to cost savings, and therefore you can increase your profitability. It can also spur product development and product innovation. So LCAs can inform product design. Yeah, if you have all this detailed information, you can then try and build the perfectly sustainable product. And this can lead to a new product line, or will resonate with more environmentally conscious consumers, and then therefore will increase your sales and revenue. And all this will give you, I guess, more access to markets, or access to other markets and other regions that you might not have been operating in before. But also governments are looking at, companies or products with a lower environmental impact. So I think there's a huge potential there to explore new markets. And I think what's important with LCAs is as well that you know how to communicate your data properly, not to be subject to greenwashing. But if you do it all right, you will definitely gain a competitive advantage and open up new markets for your business. We talked about risk mitigation a little bit before when I talked about compliance and regulation, but I think the point that Alex wanted to make here as well is, apart from all the regulatory risks, there's also now at a time where there's wars going on and or pandemics and resource scarcity, I guess resource availability plays a bigger role. And therefore, if you are very aware of your impacts or the life cycle of your products, you can reduce this risk and therefore reduce any disruption to your business operations. And also you can attract new investors. So ESG is a big buzzword in the financial world right now. And more and more investors actually require companies to show their ESG credentials. CDP is one example, the Carbon Disclosure Project, where you need to report annually on your carbon emissions and your carbon reduction strategy, etc. So companies are asked by their investors to report to CDP. And therefore, businesses with a strong ESG performance or a good CDP score naturally will attract more investment and achieve a higher valuation. Which leads me to the next point, which is very similar, that you will have access to green financing. So by having a good ESG performance, you will attract lower interest rates, which can reduce your financing costs. And this is exactly what the European Green Deal / the taxonomy and CSRD are aiming to do, funneling money into more sustainable solutions. And last but not least, consumer loyalty. So by knowing your environmental impacts and focusing on sustainability, you will attract a more loyal consumer base, which can then act in turn as an advocate for your brand. And they will do a lot of word of mouth marketing for you, which will then again drive revenue and sales for your business. So I think these are 9 good reasons. Let's look at some examples that Alexander dug up of companies who have done that. So Nike and Apple, they develop new materials in a manufacturing process due to LCAs and actually managed to attract new customers through that. Johnson & Johnson and Procter & Gamble developed new packaging, which was way easier to recycle and therefore managed to reduce their cost. Hewlett Packard was able to reduce their energy cost by 20% through LCA assessments, which resulted in a huge reduction of operating cost, and then obviously in an increase in their environmental performance. And IKEA was able to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions from its furniture by 25% by introducing a new supply chain management system, which also led to a reduction in costs. Yeah, so we're looking at huge numbers there for companies, big companies like that. So Alex's closing remark was that there are very good reasons, or plenty of reasons, for doing an LCA, but he wanted to note that you might not necessarily see the impact straight away or directly, and that it's important to be patient because the effects might happen further down the line whilst you're adapting your business practices or your products or your strategies. And that was it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Judith. Well, I think those were 9 really convincing reasons. And may I say that you did a great job, and I think you did perfect justice to Alexander's presentation. While we are waiting for the questions coming in, well, maybe I am allowed to ask the first question. In your opinion, will the legislative requirements in the context of life cycle assessments be expanded in the coming years?
Yes, definitely. I mean, environmental regulations are getting more stringent, that's for sure. And sorry if I bring it up again, but it really is a key instrument right now with the EU taxonomy, even more so than the CSRD. With the EU taxonomy coming up, I think life cycle assessments will play a major role in the next few years. And also other standards or initiatives like the Paris Agreement or the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN Global Compact, they might influence that space on a more global level as well, not only in the EU, but globally. So I think it's definitely something to be prepared for and to look out for. That's for sure.
Okay, thank you. There's another question that just came in from the audience. As I understand it, life cycle assessments currently focus on environmental topics. Are there also considerations to include social aspects in LCA assessments, in life cycle assessments?
There are, and I think Michael can expand on that. I know of social life cycle assessments as CLAs, and they not only take environmental factors into account, they also look at social and socioeconomic impacts. So, for example, what impact does your company have on the local community, on the employment, etc. But I haven't personally conducted one yet. So, Michael, maybe you can shed some more light.
Yeah, I certainly can. I'd also just like to contribute to Judith's answer to the previous question as well, about the use of LCA becoming more prevalent in terms of making environmental claims as well. There is kind of pressure from the European Commission that green claims should be based on life cycle data. So we're all aware of the green claims legislation that's banning vague and arbitrary things such as carbon neutral or nature friendly, etc. But there's pressure from the European Commission that those green claims should be life cycle data driven. But just to return as well to social LCA, there are techniques that allow you to combine standard LCA with wider evaluations. Judith mentioned, for example, employment, local impacts, but also things such as microplastics, pollution, littering, etc., which aren't necessarily easily quantified in a standard LCA. There's a lot of research in towards how to combine those and bring them into the LCA framework so that we get a more comprehensive analysis. Of course, the more impacts and dimensions we include in an LCA, the more data we require to conduct it, the more uncertainty we introduce, the more complex the process, and the more complex the results to understand and communicate. But nonetheless, social LCA is potentially a very valuable development in the future.
Right. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Judith. So there are no other questions for the moment, but again, we will be happy to answer more questions on info@eurosac.org. So just send us an email and we will be happy to answer. So thank you all for your questions, and thanks, Judith, for your even double contribution today. Well, that's it for today. A big thank you to all our speakers, Judith and Michael, of course, and also a big thank you to Alexander Rosner, who couldn't attend in person, but still contributed his presentation. We really appreciate you taking the time to share your knowledge with us today. And ladies and gentlemen, this concludes this year's webinar series, Unwrapping Sustainability Across the Value Chain with Paper Sacks. We hope it has been valuable for you. The recording of today's webinar will soon be available on eurosac.org. There, as I mentioned before, you will also find a recording of last week's webinar, Closing the Loop, Advancing Recyclability in Paper Sacks, in case you missed it. Any additional questions and comments, as I said already before, can be sent to info@eurosac.org. Please also send us an email if you have a specific topic in mind that you would like to see covered in a future webinar. So on behalf of EUROSAC and CEPI Eurokraft, thank you for your active participation. We appreciate your time and engagement. Stay connected, for example, via the EUROSAC LinkedIn channel, and we look forward to seeing you in future webinars. So goodbye and take care.